What's up, everybody? Oh, SaaStr. It's good to be back. Well, January 2020, I was having a bit of an existential crisis. But I was hanging out with my buddy Brian Balfour, who's big into the growth scene here in the Valley, and basically talking to him about that there are some companies out there that seem to be really, really good executors, but aren't necessarily doing extremely well. And then there's folks that we objectively or somewhat subjectively believe aren't that great of executors, but seem to be doing really, really well. And it led to a question that we kind of had over coffee, which was, how much can you actually impact growth? How much is what you're actually doing with your execution versus how much is just the market that you end up being in? And I did what I've been known to do from time to time, and I locked myself in this Estonian hotel. This was all 3 days with a whiteboard and a bunch of data. I came out looking like this, which was really, really exciting, and basically built out an index that answered the question, at least based on the SaaS and subscription community, of how much of the growth is actually powered by the market. And what was really powerful about this, at least in my mind, is it was able to kind of show us what has happened in the history of SaaS, which a lot of us don't really understand because we just kind of see what's in front of us and the growth of our own companies. But it was able to kind of show like what was kind of going on over the course of the different ages that we've seen in our community. And so I want to kind of break this down, and then there'll be a fun bunch of actionable things for you in your retention and automation and monetization and all that kind of fun stuff. But I wanted to basically start by helping you answer this question and giving a little bit of a history lesson here. And so in the beginning, 1960s and 1990s, but in the beginning, God, or IBM, they created the mainframe, and it was good. This was one of those things where they started off just kind of tipping the scales towards this world of the cloud that we now all live in. And they were basically kind of putting it out there that there was ways that you could build a company, especially in this newfangled world of software, where you could actually kind of push the limits of what our software and also, frankly, our hardware was doing. And this particular age is known as kind of like the prehistoric age of SaaS. And you were actually focused on stability, you were focused on speed, but more of like the speed of your product and just trying to get your hardware working. And oftentimes you were evangelizing to the point where you're just trying to convince people to actually use something, let alone the actual utility and all the fancy bells and whistles that were actually out there. And then all of a sudden with SSL, we all of a sudden had payments kind of evolve. And what was really kind of fascinating is that as we kind of looked at how much we could impact growth, it was beautiful to see that we were actually able to impact growth a bit back in this day. This is a graphical representation of a number of different companies that we were basically able to study based on their data. And what it kind of led us to asking is, what was the difference between the companies that weren't doing so well and the companies that were doing really, really well in this age? And what we found is that the difference between these particular groups was that the groups that were doing really, really well were spending 14 times more just in terms of their budget for all types of different things than the groups that weren't necessarily doing too well in this market. And this is where the advice that a lot of us have gotten back in the day here has been, spend money like it's water, go out and buy the market. And this is what birthed basically the golden age of SaaS, where Constant Contact, you have Salesforce, and all of a sudden this focus on dev productivity really came into playing, where all of a sudden the focus was, we need to ship features as quickly as humanly possible. We need to get out into the market. We need to buy the market as much as humanly possible because the people who are successful are the ones that are spending that much more than those who are not successful. Now, what's interesting is the cloud kind of came into being, and then all of a sudden we had all these brand new marketing channels every single quarter to spend all of that money. We have a really interesting answer to this whole notion of if we can actually impact growth. Because what most of us did, at least most of the people that we get a lot of advice from who were back working in this particular age, we all like to think that, hey, we're geniuses, right? All this growth that's happening because we're spending so much money and it's awesome. But in reality, when we look at how much you could actually impact growth, the answer is not much. What's interesting is that the market drove a lot of the growth here. There wasn't that big of a difference between the people who were successful and the people who were just not as successful. We were seeing a market where everything was great, and yes, you could crash and burn and be terrible, but it wasn't necessarily because of what the market was doing. It was very much because of just really operational failures. And so everything was great until it wasn't. We were a product of our success. And what ended up happening is that we started to get so successful that it actually spelled a lot of our own doom, or at least a lot of our own difficulty. Competition 10x. Everyone and their mother has a website now. Everyone and their mother might have a SaaS product as well, which is really interesting. And with that came customer acquisition costs increasing about 70% because we haven't really had a brand new marketing channel since 2015. And then software wasn't as magical anymore. You used to be able to put a login screen on a database and you were looked at as a god. Now all of a sudden, if it doesn't have good support, doesn't have everything I want, like I'm not even gonna give you the time of day. We've actually seen this in willingness to pay data where value is actually down. But this is what rose the whole customer centricity era that we're currently in. This is why customer success is a thing, product marketing is a thing. Not just dev productivity, but also customer research is such a big thing because we're competing just for mind share, let alone for the actual dollars of wallet. And what's kind of interesting is for a very different reason, how much could you actually impact growth? It's actually quite a bit. This is what the spread looks like now. Now, the difference between these two groups isn't because of the amount of money you're spending, although money definitely does help this difference. But what's really kind of fascinating is that you're now in control of your destiny more so than you ever have been in the SaaS ecosystem. The market is important, don't get me wrong, but when we look at things or the companies that are doing really, really well versus those who aren't doing well, the things that are in their control is really just having to be exceptional at a lot of different things. And I know that kind of begs the thought of like, oh crap, like what if I mess this up, right? What if I actually mess up like this opportunity I have to actually have control and not have to necessarily raise a bunch of money, although raising a bunch of money certainly does help. And so what we want to do is kind of examine what are these companies doing that's a little bit different. And I'm not going to be able to go through everything, but a lot of the talks that I've at least listened to the past 2 days actually cover this. And what's really, really kind of fascinating is when we go into like, what do you need to do in order to be one of the successful companies of this era? What we find is it starts with like really basic fundamentals. Your product permeates everything. It needs to be fantastic. And I'm not a product person, I'm more of a go-to-market person, so I'm not gonna be able to tell you how to make a great product, but there's plenty of talks that will be able to help that. But when we look at NPS scores between the different companies who are growing really, really well versus not, and then other measurements, because some of you don't like NPS, so we made sure to look at a bunch of other things, what we typically discover is that their product is very, very highly engaged and very, very well liked by their target customer. The other thing that they're doing is they are spending about 60% of their budgets on acquisition. They're really, really good at acquiring customers. But those folks who are doing really, really well typically are also moving that revenue per customer through really good monetization. And then they're also, again, a fundamental, retaining customers at a really, really high rate. Now you might be thinking that this is like really obvious and something that you've always known. But if you really think about what was going on in the golden age of SaaS, if you're old enough to understand that, or actually have seen that, versus what's going on right now, you'll know that back in the day, things like monetization, retention, and even product quality wasn't necessarily something that everyone was really focused on. But now today, growth is basically this flywheel improving pretty consistently. And so there's a lot of different ways that we can unpack what's good, what's bad, to get a little bit more specific here. But where I'm gonna kind of focus the rest of my time here is really on the middle of this particular flywheel. And this is this concept of revenue automation that started to kind of pop up here and there. And the basic idea here is that revenue automation is the thing that makes the flywheel spin as quickly as possible and also kind of doesn't distract from the product aspects or the customer aspects of your growth. It's kind of like the lubricant for the actual flywheel for its moving. And we're going to unpack this in a couple of different ways, but just to make sure we define it a little bit further, basically this talks about automating revenue protection and also baking growth in your pricing and packaging. These are the things that you kind of set once, or you make sure that you set in a particular way and then you don't have to worry about ever again. And as I already mentioned, it really reduces that friction that distracts from product, your customer, and growth. And so that's what we're going to unpack, and why the heck should you listen to me? Well, it's not about me. We're going to follow the data, but my personal background's in econometrics and math, which is code for having a lot of friends as a child. Basically, I started my career building, value modeling for the NSA, and then I worked at Google doing kind of the same thing. So I haven't really seen a lot of sunlight in my life. But what's really kind of interesting is we run a company called ProfitWell, and ProfitWell, we build these automation products for revenue. And what's kind of fascinating about what we build is we have this core product called ProfitWell Metrics that you basically plug into your subscription management system, Stripe, Zora, Chargebee, Chargeify, whatever you're using. And we basically give you free access to all of your financial data, all of your reporting. And because of a few things, we think it's pretty good. We have about 30,000 different companies using that product, and that's given us the largest bevy of SaaS data, financial data at least, that we're able to study and understand what's working and what isn't, and we can kind of apply that to this revenue automation thesis. So we're going to jump in, kind of talk through what's going on with not only revenue automation, but the data. And if it's okay with all of you, I have all the graphs in the deck, but just for the sake of time and everyone kind of being spaced out, I'm not going to spend a lot of time just like on every graph, but just know that it's there, know that the data's there, and that you can get it in the deck when you get it afterwards if you're interested. Does that work for all of you? Are you guys fired up? Okay, because now we're going to start going fast. So Professor Paticus is going to stop, slowly going here. We're going to jump in. All right, let's jump in. So the first thing we're going to talk about is subscription retention. And I specifically wore my retention outfit. I have my red pants and my black revenue shirt here. I'm basically a walking P&L. And thankfully, there's a lot more black because of my size here. But anyways, how do we automate retention, right? These dad jokes are for me, just so you know. I don't really care if you laugh or not. But how do we actually automate retention? The first thing is we got to understand how we measure retention. And all of you hopefully know a couple of different calculations for things like churn and retention. But the basic idea is how do we keep customers around longer and those existing customers paying us more money, right? A lot of different ways to measure it. The two core measurements typically are net revenue retention. In the world of SaaS, you got to be over 100%. That's the name of the game. A lot of other folks, typically we're looking at also our user churn or our revenue churn, which is basically a piece of that net revenue retention. Three big parts. You got active cancellations, you have expansion revenue, and you have the sexiest topic in the world, payment failures, okay? Sometimes it's invoice failures depending on the size of your company. But the reason I break this out is because you're probably in a little bit of an embarrassing manner. There's very few of you who understand these three numbers within your business right now. Yeah, you might have like a spreadsheet or a graph, but very, very few of you understand what is the proportion of how bad we are at our expansion revenue versus what's going on with payment failures or even collections failures that are out there. So what I recommend when it comes to like subscription retention, the first thing you should be doing is basically looking at what are those three numbers in your business, because you might be surprised, especially if you look at some benchmarks, you're doing really, really well at active cancellations, but you're just absolutely terrible at expansion revenue and things like that. And then you kind of know where you can kind of dig in. So we're going to start with active cancellations. And we're not going to be able to go through everything, but there's a couple of things that are on this slide that we're going to go deeper on. We're going to focus kind of on the tactical bits, things that you can kind of just implement and do really, really well with. But this really comes down to how do you reduce the number of people clicking that button to say, hey, I want to leave. And the first thing that I think a lot of people miss out on is this whole concept of plan optimization, or as I like to call term optimization. And the basic idea is that those customers who are on longer term plans, 6 months, 12 months or beyond, they typically churn less, which feels really, really intuitive, right? They have one purchasing decision every 3, 6, 12, 36 months versus one implicit decision that's happening every single month. Now, the problem is that I don't think you realize the gravity of how high the LTV is with these longer term customers. Right now on the data, and I broke this out into some segments, you can look at the graph later, typically you're looking at about 100 to 300% higher lifetime value, and most of the time the variance gets much, much higher. Here's the graph. Here's also a graph of based on your price point, what proportion of annuals that you should have within your business. But the thing that I see a lot of people make mistakes around is that the only time that they ask someone to upgrade to a longer term plan is when that person signs up. And it's kind of like the old dating metaphor where you're kind of asking someone to commit to a longer term, wedding down the road or something like that, when you first met them in that first or that second date, right? And the issue is that one of the best times to get someone to upgrade to a longer term plan, and this all assumes you're doing a self-serve or at least a product-led growth model, is that essentially at that 2 to that 10th month within their life cycle. Because that's where they're actually seeing the value, that's where they're getting exposed to it. And it's actually quite simple to go out and offer a free month. A lot of you are offering way too high of discounts typically for your annual plans. And then just make sure it's a really, really clean experience where they can sign up and then keep the thing moving. And if you set something up like this, it's one of those things where it just pays dividends forever. You can get a lot more sophisticated than just the basic thing that I just set up, but it works really, really well. Now, the other big piece here are win-backs and also triaging those cancellations. Offboarding is not as important as onboarding, but offboarding is one of those things that can be really, really powerful. And what you want to do is that when someone wants to leave, you want to add a little bit of friction. You do not want to hijack your customer and force them to contact you, force them to call in order to cancel the particular subscription. We've actually seen in the data, it's not in this deck, that will actually dramatically reduce your reactivations basically in the next 6 to 12 months. And so that hijacking, that really bad offboarding experience, it creates a really, really bad taste in folks' mouth, and all of a sudden reactivations become super, super problematic, which, it's a good area of growth. So what I want to do is, instead of hijacking them and instead of just letting them leave, I typically want to do a 1 to 2 question survey where I basically ask, one, why are you leaving? But then what a lot of people don't remember is to kind of tap into the psychological phenomenon of senioritis. I actually want to say, hey, why did you like the product, right? I want to remind them that there was some value here. And then based on those 2 particular answers, I can offer up things like salvage offers. Hey, stick around for a free month. You don't have to offer up a free month, but a lot of times there's reasons that people cancel that have nothing to do with you. And all of a sudden, if they're going to cancel and they select, I didn't have enough time to see value, I can offer that free month or a particular discount to stick around, and then that next month they end up sticking around at the full price, and so on and so forth. I can offer up things like maintenance plans. This is a really underutilized piece in the world of B2B SaaS. And in B2B SaaS with maintenance plans, you're basically saying, I'm going to hold all of your data. I'm going to hold all of your personalizations. I'm going to hold everything. You can't use the product, but for $10 a month, $100 a month, some kind of token amount, I at least can have you stick around. And then we've all probably heard of pause plans, and then freemium. If you have freemium, putting them down on a freemium tier. And then I'm always okay playing chicken. If they say like, hey, you didn't have this feature, hey, this was this terrible experience, and they're not willing to get on the phone, it's okay to let them go, right? But what's really kind of fascinating is what we found in the data is that you should be able to lower cancellations by 10 to 25% with salvage offers and offboarding. And if you're kind of tracking along in terms of the data, that's a dramatic amount. That's a lot of LTV, and that's a lot of revenue that you're missing out because you don't want to put together a little survey or something like that to kind of like make sure you're moving these people along in the right direction. And here's the data to kind of back that up with some segmentation. Now, the other thing here is don't forget to win back those customers. Almost 90% of awareness, or 90% of growth sometimes is awareness, where you're just trying to make sure that people have heard of you. And a lot of your customers, when they cancel, they're not canceling because of you, they're canceling because a lot of things that are happening in their life. And don't get me wrong, like there's a lot of people canceling because of you, so I don't want you to feel too good about yourself. But there's, depending on the type of business, we see typically a third, if not a little bit more of those customers, it's because their budget dried up, but they'll be back. It's because a project ended, a whole host of things. But you got to ask, right? Here's some copy that's worked for folks who have churned and also folks who have churned delinquent, meaning they no longer paid, but you already have that awareness game, so it's super, super powerful. Sound good? We feel good about active cancellations? We still fired up? Yeah. You're my guy back there. I appreciate you. Let's go! That seems like not something to be too proud of, but okay. Let's talk about expansion revenue. I don't know why, but I think we're scared to ask people to buy more things. And we're not really using the power of our advocates. To give you a little perspective, and I have a deeper report I can send you on this, the best subscription companies out there, and best SaaS companies, I can define it a little bit further, they typically have about 20% or more of their new revenue each month coming from their existing customer base. This is where you get the beautiful greater than 100% net revenue retention, all that kind of fun stuff. Most of you, it's under 10%, and most of you, it's like 3 to 0%, because you're not doing anything and you don't have any way for that person to upgrade. Now, in terms of things that you can do, some more tactical bits here, add-ons. Add-ons are the most underutilized aspect of any subscription or SaaS pricing model. It's something where it's not quite a full cross-sell where you need an entirely new product, but it's something that you can kind of break off from a particular tier and kind of sell to everyone, especially on a subscription basis. It gets really, really powerful to compound your growth. We did a study where we compared those customers who had at least one add-on to those customers who had no add-ons. And basically those customers with add-ons had about 20 to 50% higher lifetime value. And this was not only because they were paying you more, but also because they stuck around longer, because they were more ingested into your brand and more ingested into your product, which is really, really powerful. Now, the other thing, and I saw a couple people talk about this, but I think it's something that you should realize a lot earlier in life cycles than most SaaS companies, is that the future of growth is really looking like multi-product. So this is not just like an add-on like priority support or analytics. This starts to mean kind of like the HubSpot model where you sell marketing automation, then you sell sales CRM and so on and so forth, fully featured products. And the reason for this is that we've all discovered that basically you just grow faster by selling more stuff, right? Which is a really easy concept to understand, but really, really difficult to execute. Typically, multi-product companies are growing at about 30 to 50% higher rates. And again, it's because they have those additional SKUs. It's not easy. It's definitely not easy. And normally you want to wait till you're about 10 million to start getting into this. But it is one of those things where this is where, when dev productivity has kind of reached a really, really good clip for most of us, you want to be able to ship more things and more SKUs, and you want to start with add-ons and then eventually get into multi-product. Now, in terms of the next topic, this is my favorite topic, value metrics. Value metrics are what you charge for. Basically, you can charge per user, per 100 visits, per 1,000 whatsits, whatever you're kind of selling. This is the thing that if you kind of get everything else wrong, this is the thing that'll save you, okay? But only about 50% of SaaS companies right now are pricing in this manner. Most of you are actually, or just under most of you, are actually pricing on very feature differentiation. Now, why is this so powerful? Well, it's growth, right? It's just really, really powerful growth. Light green here are those who are using value metrics. Dark green, those folks who are using feature differentiation. And where this growth comes from is typically cancellations are much, much lower. You're normally seeing much less churn because people are downgrading because they aren't using that 10th seat or that 11th seat. But they're not necessarily canceling because they're actually getting what they pay for. And the other aspect of this, and here's the data that backs it up, the other aspect of this is that the expansion revenue is much, much higher. Instead of me having to convince you like, hey, you know this feature that you want? You're gonna have to like upgrade to get that particular feature, so I have to like resell you on it. Instead of doing that, it's just like a very basic conversation where I go, hey, you're using an 11th seat. Amazing, congratulations, you're growing, that's awesome. We're just gonna bump you up to the next tier, and if there's an issue, just let us know, right? It's a very different conversation, and what we notice is that expansion revenue is typically about double for those using pricing and value metrics. And I'm gonna be a little bit of a tease and not go deep into how to actually do and figure out your value metric because it would be an entire talk, and they're already mad that I have too many slides, so I'm just gonna keep going. Sound good? All right, I can say screw them if you want. No, I'm just kidding, I can't do that. All right, next topic. Whew. Sexiest topic in the world, credit cards. Who here has a credit card? Most of you are lying. You all have credit cards. Here's the problem, or here's the opportunity, I should say. There you go, marketing, opportunities, not problems. Okay, here's the opportunity. Credit cards are mechanical devices subject to failure, okay? There are 130 different reasons why a credit card fails. We are gonna go through every single one right now. I'm kidding, we're not gonna do that. But here's the thing. This is the single largest bucket of lost customers if you are a credit card-based business. If you're doing pure invoices, it's probably closer to about 5 to 10%. But for most SaaS companies, you're looking at about 20 to 40% of your lost customers are coming or happening because of payment failures. Some countries are a little bit different, but it's always the single largest bucket of lost customers. And it's because of those 130 different reasons, mainly because there isn't one reason that all of a sudden is the reason to figure out. Expirations tend to be the highest reason these credit cards fail. And it depends on the business, so it's a little bit high variance, but normally it's only about 10 to 15% of these failures. Now, why is this happening? Why are you losing so many customers? Well, it's because Stripe hasn't figured, no, I'm just kidding. Stripe is figuring it out, which is really good. We're not gonna blame them, but we're pretty bad at recovering failed payments. Right now, if you have 100 people who have their credit card fail, you're typically only gonna recover about 30 of them. And the best companies out there are typically recovering about 60 to 80 of them. There's gonna have some folks that this is their excuse to leave you, but you should be really getting in that 60 to 80% range. Every business is gonna be a little bit different, but the big thing to kind of keep in mind is the game of inches or centimeters. I know there's a lot of non-US folks here, sorry. There's a couple of things, I'm not gonna be able to go into like all of credit card theory, which I'm great at parties, guys. A lot of credit card theory I can talk about here, but the biggest thing is that you have to like go out and get updated payment information for most of these failures. Not all of them, you can do retries and a bunch of other fun things, but a lot of these you have to get a customer to actually fill something out. So here are a couple of pitfalls that people run into. First, for expirations, do not use an email before the point of failure. Now I know some of you are like really fancy and you're like, Patrick, I'm really, really good at email and I'm gonna segment it, and I'm gonna do all this research and I'm gonna send a really picture perfect email. And you can do email if you're that type of person, but for the rest of you, do not send emails for expirations. Do in-app notifications, maybe one SMS text message, but email typically correlates to about 10 to 20% higher active cancellations. So literally just turn this email off tomorrow and you will lower your churn, which is pretty cool. The other thing to kind of keep in mind is that the bulk of recovery is going to come from email, SMS, and these messaging. Do not use stylized, markety looking emails. I know you're like, your brand's really cool and like you got this unified brand going on and you want to like make it look really pretty. Your email's going to get archived. That's what's about to happen. Stylized emails, they don't necessarily, or plain text emails typically see a 50% higher engagement rate than those stylized emails. And when I talk about plain text, I mean like people confused if it's coming from like an automated email or if it's like an actual plain text email that's being sent. It's really, really powerful. Mainly because people think like, oh, it's coming from Kate in support. I'm gonna let Kate down unless I like respond and say I don't want the product anymore or I don't get my credit card updated. For those who are more advanced, localizing these particular emails is really powerful. So this is an example of like a plain text email that I'm talking about localized into Spanish. And then the other thing to kind of keep in mind, one of the big pitfalls is don't make your user log in to update their credit card. Make it so that they can just click through the email. They get a nice little form that's on your website that's mobile optimized. Hopefully it has Apple and Google Pay mixed in, but if you can't go that far, at least do some of the basics here. But this is the thing that reduces a lot of friction. We've seen about 60% of these types of messages get opened on mobile. And if someone doesn't remember their password manager isn't set up properly, all these other things, you're going to lose out on that particular customer. They're going to forget, and you're kind of fighting a time game here. So there's a lot of things that we don't have time to get into, but this is the thing to kind of keep in mind, especially with payment failures. It's an infrastructure problem that can be solved by just doing some mechanical things. Cool? Was that pretty sexy? Nice. It's a B2B conference, I know. All right. Subscription monetization. All right, we're going to talk about pricing, right? So here's the thing with automating pricing. A lot of you think your pricing is just the number on the page, right? Like that's the only thing that comes down to pricing. What we've found with those companies who are doing really, really well, their pricing is actually more than just the number. It's all these different things that they're experimenting on a quarterly basis. So one quarter, they might do things like price localization, which we'll talk about in a second. The next quarter, they're going to do and figure out their add-on strategy. The quarter after that, they're going to readjust their value metric. That's a really big thing that those companies who are doing really, really well, they're changing something about their pricing every 3 months. And some that are doing really, really well and very fast, they're changing something about their pricing every month. Not the number, but other things around the number. Really, you can only raise prices probably once, but every year or so, unless you're really moving quickly. So there's a lot of other things you can kind of change about your monetization. So the big thing here, we already spoke about value metrics. Value metrics, again, if you get everything else wrong, especially when it comes to your pricing, but you get your value metric right, not even the level of value metric, just like, is it users, is it views, what is it? You can probably be pretty okay. This gives you a 1-2 punch, not only with your pricing, but also with your retention, which is really, really powerful. The other thing we talked about was add-ons. Add-ons, this is really applicable not only for retention, but it's also extremely applicable to the world of monetization. And then the other thing that I just kind of mentioned is that price localization is a really good starter project if you're a larger company that has about 20% of your core base outside of your home region. It's a good starter project because it forces you to get your billing system in order. It forces you to like go through the politics of changing something about your pricing, which even if you have the best culture in the world, there's going to be plenty of politics. Pricing typically sits at the kind of precipice of uncomfortable and important. And whenever you have something like that, like religion, politics, pricing, normally it can get really controversial and fun. And so it's one of those things where this is a good way to start. To give you some numbers as to why this is really powerful, localization typically increases your revenue per customer by about 10 to 20%. What you're looking at here is on the far left, you're essentially seeing no localization. One click up, you're seeing cosmetic localization, so just making sure that the currency symbol is properly set up. And then the rest of the lines are basically companies that are doing actual region-based localization. So they have the US price at $100, and then the effective price in the UK is $150. And the reason this works is because we all have different willingnesses to pay depending on the density of the market. In this particular graph, you're basically seeing what you should be priced relative to the United States if you weren't going to collect data. You should collect data because there's really high variance, but basically what we see, and this controls for VAT and it controls for exchange rates, normally the willingness to pay is about 30 to 40% higher in the Nordics, 40 to 50% lower in places like Southeast Asia relative to the US. But You normally won't see like the order of this change, but you might see the variance of this change. And that's why you should kind of do this as an initial project. The next thing we're going to talk about is freemium. Who's excited for that? Who hates freemium? I know you exist. There we go. Love you. Okay. I used to hate freemium. Some of the earliest blog posts we wrote at ProfitWell, I was like, F freemium. Freemium sucks. It was back in my immature founder days. They're still here. But freemium is a really, really big thing that I think you're all going to have to at least debate in the next 5 to 10 years. And the TLDR as to why is because you have all this density going on in the market, and assuming you're selling to someone that is swiping out a credit card, or even someone that's like hard to get in front of, even from an enterprise sales perspective, the best content you can have is an actual product that they're going to actually use, and they're going to actually be nurtured from a lead perspective based on a product that's pretty good. Now, the other thing you got to keep in mind here is that a lot of other people don't realize the power that freemium has relative to not using a particular freemium model. To give you some numbers here, customer acquisition cost for those customers that become paying customers from a freemium plan, it's typically about 50% less than those who came in through a traditional sales process or a traditional landing page structure. And it's pretty powerful. Now, this CAC is going up over time, but it is one of those things where those customers coming in through free can be really powerful, especially if you look at them on a cohort basis over time. The other thing that's really powerful, retention for these customers once they're paying is much, much better. And the reason is that essentially you're putting the onus of conversion on a customer understanding and falling in love with your product rather than some artificial sales process or an artificial timeline of some sort of free trial. Now, there's ways that you can actually set up freemium that acts like a free trial or acts like that sales process, but all of a sudden that retention of that user when they're converting, when they actually want to convert, is one of those things where those folks retain at a much, much higher rate. And then the final really interesting thing about this is that these typically are more satisfied customers. NPS is typically double for those individuals who converted from a freemium plan versus any other plan. On the far left here, you're essentially looking at NPS about 5-6 years ago. And notice how over time, when you're looking at the other set of 3 bars, NPS overall has gone down, which is definitely true and kind of wild, because I don't think anyone's going to say that products are worse today than they were. It's just that the expectations have changed. But freemium has basically defended that satisfaction, at least for these 350 companies, on a much, much longer basis. All right. How are we feeling? We get some value? I can econ professor all day, okay? I will do it, all right? We're good? This was the longest deck in SaaStr history, just so you know. And we have 7 minutes to spare, which is pretty exciting. All right, let's recap. Growing in this market is a lot harder than it has been, but thankfully you actually have a lot more control than you used to have. I know we all thought we were geniuses. You're getting a lot of advice from people from the old age of SaaS. Some of them have updated, and their advice around operating, executing, team management, these types of things are amazing. A lot of their advice on what's going on with the market and what needs to be pushed or not pushed, it's a little outdated, so you should be very careful with that type of advice. There's a lot of things you need to be exceptional at, but it's one of those things where there has never been as many resources and tools and all kinds of things that take care of a lot of these things. We spend a lot of time on revenue automation, basically getting that wheel kind of moving as quickly as possible with a lot of these things that you can kind of just put on the back burner. If you have any questions at all, we're not doing Q&A live, but if you have any questions at all, I'm just at patrick@profitwell.com. If you want to get this data, we publish data all the time. I'm basically just throw data out all the time. It's just a lot of fun. But we publish a lot of benchmarks and things like that, and we also publish a lot of like how-tos on a lot of this stuff as well. So if you have any questions, hit me up at patrick@profitwell.com. We got a cool booth over there. We think it's pretty cool. We also have a van that I'm living in, so that's exciting. That's a weird statement to say in front of your peers, but it's a marketing strategy. It's great. But come find us. I love talking about this stuff. We got some cool swag, and with that, thank you very much, everybody.